Okay, hopefully everybody sees the slide there. That's training 102. Um, Here again, like last week, here's just our introductory slide with our contact information for myself and Shirley. You are more than welcome to contact us at any time if you have any questions about anything relating to being a trustee, or if you just want to call and vent a little bit, fine too. This is my disclaimer because, again, we're going to be talking about some legal things here. And unfortunately, I cannot be your attorney, or fortunately, um, but I can assist you with finding an attorney if you don't have one. Every library should have their own attorney that specializes in library law. Even if you use your municipal attorney, you should also hire an attorney, or at least have the phone number of an attorney who specializes in library law. I keep a list of attorneys in the state who practice library law. They're all over the state. Some of them are, solo practitioners. Some of them work in big firms. So I have a wide range. It's always good even just to have the phone number of someone to call if you should need them. You don't have to, do a retainer. You don't have to invest a lot of money up front. So this disclaimer just says that you understand that what we talk about today is information and not legal advice. So what we're going to be talking about today, last week, if you remember, we did read. This week is flow. Boards going with the flow. We're going to be talking about library funding and finances and money. And we're going to be talking about your library and director relationship with the board, which, it's one of those things. Like when I was a little girl, I always had really curly hair. And my mom would say that I think it's actually a poem. I'm not sure. But there was a little girl who had very curly hair, who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good, and when she was bad, she was horrid. So that's something that comes to mind sometimes when we talk about boards and directors. That when the relationship is good, it's really good, but when it's bad, it goes very bad. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that's about, and we're going to talk about public records and the Open Meetings Act and how that translates to what your position is and the kinds of things you should know about that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is funding. So how are public libraries funded? This is something that actually I find that a lot of trustees can be a little confused about. But it's a very important part of your job, as we talked about last week, right? Your fiduciary duty, your responsibility to ensure that your library is funded properly, and that your staff and your director have everything they need in order to carry forward the priorities and the strategic plan that the board puts in place. And you're also tasked with making sure you know where the money is, right? What's going on with the library money? That's a major part of your responsibilities as a public official and as a board member. So public libraries are funded primarily in these 5 different ways. You have your local support, you have penal fines and state aid. And then there's a few other programs at the state level where you get some money. And then there's fundraising, right? There's donations, and you may have a friends group or you may fundraise on your own. So when we talk about local support, primarily we're talking about 2 types of funding. Local support means money that comes from your community. So we're talking about millages. If you have, a property tax that goes where the revenue goes to the library, or we're talking about if you work with your municipality and they give you money from their operation budget, their tax. And millages, depending on your establishment, and remember, we talked about establishment last week, depending on the kind of library you have authority, or you have the ability to go for a millage of between 1 and 4 mills. For most libraries in our state, the majority of libraries in our state are small and rural libraries, and they tend to be PA 164s, so city or village or township libraries. And they typically have between 1 and 2 limits of 1 to 2 mills. Now, you may remember that we talked last week about libraries. There's multiple types of libraries under that act, and there's 3 different city libraries. One of those city libraries is a library that is able to have 1 mill of a millage without a vote that is determined by their city council, and 1 millage of a voted millage if the board chooses to go for a voted millage. That is the city section 1 under PA 164. And that would be if you're a city library and you have an appointed board, then odds are you are a PA 164 city library under section 1. And that would mean you could have a 5, a 7, or 9 member appointed board, and you would have the ability to have 1 mill of a millage without a vote and 1 mill of a millage voted millage. Every other PA 164 has a 2 mill limit, and districts have 4 mill limit. Now, other libraries like county libraries and charter township libraries, and if you're a home rule city library, those get a little bit stickier because those are it's up to the municipality. So county libraries it's up to the county to go for the amount of the millage that the county would like to provide the library with. There really isn't a limit written into the statute. Home rule city libraries and charter township libraries are libraries where the municipality is actually the governing board for the library. And in those instances, there is no ability for a voted millage written into the statute. So those are situations where, again, the municipality would make a decision whether or not to go for a millage for those 2 entities. Shirley, you are the millage queen, empress. Is there anything you would like to add about millages as local support? Oh, you're muted.
I'd also like to remind people, if they're listening, that some of the municipalities have a millage tomorrow on election day, and make sure they get out and vote.
Absolutely.
That is a time in the life of the library, and obviously they need operational millages. So one that I'm doing is a bond issue. That's also very important. But no, thanks, Claire. You explained it very well.
So millages are very stable support, forms of support. If you're a PA 164 library, so if you're, again, a township, village, city library with an appointed board, in order to have been established, you would have had to have a millage. And so some libraries who are currently under PA 164, over the years, they started out with a millage way back in 1890 or the early 1900s. And then as the years went on, for various reasons, they may have dropped their millage. So they may be under an appropriation. Millages tend to be a lot more stable than appropriations. They tend to benefit libraries a lot more. Appropriations can be very subject to political whims and to, historical arguments, problems within the, relationship between the city or the municipality and the library. So there can be different things that affect appropriations. And so they're not always the most stable form of funding, but for some libraries, it's what they have. Particularly, again, if you're something like a home rule city library or a charter township library, or even, like I said, many PA 164s also have appropriations. District libraries can also be funded by appropriations. So district libraries have an option. They can be funded pretty much any way that the various, remember, a district library is formed by municipal partners getting together and forming a contract. So part of that contract is that they can fund their library whatever way they feel is appropriate. They have the ability to go for a millage, but they're not required to go for a millage like many PA 164 libraries. So district libraries, you always want to double check your district library agreement to see exactly what the basis of the funding is. But again, just because it started out in the district library agreement doesn't mean that's how it always has to be. Your district library agreement can be amended. So then we move to penal fines. Now, penal fines, when we talk about state aid to library eligibility, penal fines, there's a portion of the penal fine law that requires libraries to have 3/10 of a mil of local support from the areas they serve in order to be eligible for state aid. So when the Library of Michigan looks at local support for us, we also include penal fines as local support. So we look at the amount of money that your library receives from millages or appropriations. We look at things like donations. We look at penal fines. We look at if you have a contract with another municipality and they pay you money for library service, we look at that money as well. So penal fines, because they are collected within your area, within your county, we look at that as local money because it's not state money, it's actually county money. So penal fines come to libraries via the Constitution. It's been in the Michigan Constitution since the very first Michigan Constitution. It's always been renewed. In the 1963 Constitution, which is our current Constitution, it also described that there should be a law that helps assist how the penal fines are given out. So we have the Distribution of Penal Fines to Public Libraries Act. This act kind of declares how we calculate penal fines to public libraries. And essentially what happens is every year, the Library of Michigan, and this is what Joe does, he provides each individual county treasurer with a list of all of the libraries in their county, public libraries that are eligible for penal fines, and he gives them the population of each of those library service areas. So their legal service area, which is the service area that the people you serve by virtue of your establishment. So for example, if you're a city library, it would be the population of your city. If you're a district library, it's the population of those municipalities that form your district. They also include any contracted areas you have. So again, if you have a contract with another municipality to give them service, that population is included as well. And he also provides the population of the county, because we get those populations from the Treasury Department. And the Treasury Department uses the most recent decennial census. So the numbers that we use, that Library of Michigan uses and that Treasury uses, may be a little different than populations that your library director holds on to or that you look up, because there are various tools that the Census Bureau uses that updates the decennial census. Well, we don't use those. We only use the decennial census. So our numbers are updated at the end of the conclusion of the decennial census, and those are the numbers we use until the next decennial census, unless an individual municipality or county feels that their population has changed enough that they want to do their own specialized custom census with the Census Department, and they have to pay for that. And then those numbers we will adopt if those are used. But for now, we use the decennial census numbers as given to us by Treasury, and they're inputted into our system automatically. So the way that penal fines are calculated is penal fines are calculated on basis. So what happens is the county treasurer takes the amount of money they receive from the courts. So they receive money from the courts for any fine paid by people as a result of being convicted of a criminal act, and there's a fine in the statute or a fine that is assessed to them. So that's just the statutory fine, right? It's not court costs or anything else, just a statutory fine. And then they also take monies that come from the courts that adjudicate traffic infractions or civil infractions. And those monies are added to the pot of money that comes from the criminal infractions. And together, those amounts are what we call the penal fines. The reason why we do it that way is because years ago, penal fines were all just criminal fines. But what happened was traffic fines were broken off criminal from criminal court and put into civil court. So traffic infractions were taken out of criminal court. When that happened, the legislature said, hey, if we take the traffic fines away from public libraries, they're going to lose a whole lot of money. And this is not in keeping with the intent of the constitutional dictate. So we're going to go ahead and still give libraries traffic fines, even though they are now civil. So, that's why now the library gets civil fines from traffic and we still get the criminal fines. So sometimes at the county level, they break them into two parts, but the combination, the sum of the criminal fines and the civil fines are what we call penal fines. So the county treasurer takes that sum, divides it by the population of the county, and they get what we call a per capita. They get an amount of money that represents, per person in the county. Then they take that per capita and they multiply it by the population of each library's service area. And then that final sum is the amount of money that is given to that library out of that penal fine pot. Now, penal fines vary from that per capita varies widely from county to county. It goes from about, I think right now it goes 15 or 19 cents per capita, all the way up. It can be as high as like $25 per capita. So it depends on the municipality, it depends on the population, it depends on a whole lot of factors. It can depend on how, the state troopers in their particular county and how often they pull people over. It depends on what a weigh station for trucks in your county or in your area. It can depend on changes in the law. When a few years ago they raised the speed limits, they went from 70 to 75 on certain areas of 69 and 170 or 127. When that happened, penal fines dropped in some areas. Also, when marijuana became legal, some areas of the state, penal fines dropped significantly. Like we could tell which areas of the state were heavy pot users and would get in trouble a lot because we could see the penal fines drop significantly. So there are variables in the law that sometimes can affect penal fines here and there. If you have a question, and I cannot stress this enough, about the penal fines that your library is receiving and whether they're accurate, or if you have a question about, well, why is my neighbor in the county next door getting so much more than us, you can contact myself and we can explain that. It's because it's pretty important if for you to understand how this works. There is information on the Library of Michigan's website, step by step how this works. So explaining it really gonna, depends on how you learn. You may not get it the first time, but there are other explanation sources there on our website. The couple things to remember about penal fines is library must be open 10 hours a week to the public in order to get penal fines, and must be legally established. Also, we calculate penal fines. So the penal fine statute dictates when the penal fines have to be dispersed, and the counties have to start dispersing them early August. So that means that Joe has to get that list out to the municipalities mid-July. And so what happens is, as of June 30th of each year, Joe takes a look at the populations of the libraries in order to send those populations to the county treasurers. So that means that whatever library is serving whatever population on June 30th is the library that's going to get paid the penal fines. Now, this is important because if you do have contracts with municipalities that are outside your legal service area for service, and your contract ends, okay, let's say that your contract terminates on, your fiscal year, which ends December 31st. If you terminate that contract December 31st, so that on June 30th of the following year, you are not serving them, then you will not get the penal fines for that whole between June 30th and December 31st of that prior year. So whoever is serving them on June 30th is who gets the penal fines for that whole preceding year that goes from July to June. So it's really important when you're looking at things like contracts that you make sure that if the contract terminates, it terminates after June 30th. Okay. And if you need, again, additional explanation on that, Joe and I will be more than happy to assist you with that and explain it further. Penal fine monies can only be sent for library purposes. Penal fines are not allowed to be distributed to municipalities. If your municipality holds your money, the penal fines will go to the municipality to be placed in the library fund, but the municipality may not take any of those funds. Penal fines sit in the account of the municipality used by the library in the library fund. Now, if an area is unserved, so if you have a municipality in your county that does not have a library and does not have library service, then they still receive penal fines for that population, but the penal fines go to an escrow account at the county marked for that municipality. And they'll just accrue and they'll just sit there and earn interest and accrue until that municipality either forms a library or contracts for service with another library. Now, what's important to understand here is that those monies, okay, penal fine monies are county monies. They're not municipal money, right? They're not municipal taxes. They're not property taxes. Those monies do not come out of the pockets of the population of the municipality. They go from the court to the county. They're county monies allocated to libraries. So if you have a municipality that is unfunded, or excuse me, that is unserved in your area, you can inquire whether there's penal fines. And if you have a contract with that municipality for service, you will receive those penal fines. But it's important to note that when you form contracts with municipalities for service, both your fiduciary duty as well as the constitutional requirement that a government entity and public money cannot lend credit means that when you form a contract for service, you have to charge fair market value for your services. So you have to charge the municipality what it costs to provide those services. And you have to meet that 3/10 of a mil of local support in order for that population to be considered to receive state aid. So if you just say, yeah, we'll do your library for only penal fines because you have this, 20 grand in penal fines that have been accruing. Well, that may cover that 3/10 of a mil for 1 year. That may be fair market value for that 1 year. But if you have a 3-year contract, years 2 and 3 are going to be not in keeping with your fiduciary duty and not in keeping with that law preventing you from lending state credit. So you want to be very aware when you're making contracts with other municipalities that you have to charge the appropriate amount of money to that municipality. And it's okay to say no. It's okay to not serve a municipality. I mean, we all want municipalities to get library service, but it's important that municipalities understand what it costs to provide library service and what your legal service area is paying to provide library service, right? Because you don't want to be in a position, which is happening across the state, where your legal service area is paying maybe $50 to $100 a year in a millage, right? Even if it's an appropriation, it's still their tax money. So they're paying $50 to $100 a year per household, per taxpayer to fund the library. And then you bring in this community next door, and that population is paying nothing out of pocket. And with the penal fines, they're paying less. So they could be, they're only paying, if you do a per capita, the penal fines, they're only paying $10 a person. So not only are they not paying out of pocket, they're paying a fraction for the same service as what your legal service area is paying. And so that means your legal service area is actually subsidizing library service for that other municipality. And that can cause a lot of problems if your legal service area figures that out. And right now, financial issues are the low-hanging fruit for libraries if people want to cause you trouble. It's very easy for people to find out what your library finances are. It's all public record. And it's very easy to figure out if if one person is paying more than another. And then when you go for your next millage, you have a good chance of a person in your community saying, well, why should I give you a millage when I'm paying for people next door to get library service? Like it can, we must have a lot of money if we can, pay for other people. So it's important that you understand how this works so that if you get faced with that, you know how to respond. And it's hard because a lot of library directors and um, a lot of board members really want to provide service, right? You want to provide service to the school in your area that is not part of your legal service area. I mean, we all understand that, but at the end of the day, as a public official and as a library board member, you have a fiduciary duty to do what's best for the library, right? Not what's best for your county and not what's best for the municipality next door. It's what's best for your library so that your community continues to have a flourishing, functioning library. So, Shirley, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think it is important to also include, this is not part of your 3/10 of your millage or your source of funding. And I think to a lot of trustees who are not aware of this that I have encountered is people don't realize there's 400 libraries in Michigan. That's why there is so much difference in how things are done. But you are totally correct about the contract areas paying the same amount as the people that have voted in a millage. That is such a hot issue across our state. And I know Clare gets that way more than I do, but it is out there. And we need to be aware of that. Not meant to be a primary funding source. We call it the frosting on the cake. That is an extra income that I'm from a big county who gets big funding, penal fine checks. And yeah, we can do a lot with that extra funding, but it is not part of our budget. And it should never be figured, well, we got this coming from the penal fines, we can put that in the budget. No, that's not what it's for. And I think that confuses some trustees and the fiduciary responsibility of the trustees. And I think it's up to the directors to explain that to their boards, how this works. Penal fines have been just a hidden blessing in so many cases in our libraries, but it is not a primary funding source as your slide shows. So thanks for asking. You did a good job of explaining that. It becomes, like I said, it's the frosting, but it's also the confusion sometimes. Penal fines. And of course, we have outside sources that would like to take our penal fines. That has been an issue off and on too for years. Thank you.
And if you have municipalities push back, right? Because a lot of municipalities think that, well, if they have penal fines, then that's their ticket to library service. There's lots of actual constitutional committee and constitutional convention notes where the legislators who were part of the constitutional convention actually discussed this, and they actually talked about situations where one municipality was subsidizing another municipality's library service and how that was not a good thing. So we can give you concrete evidence if you have a municipality that's pushing back. But again, this is something that has been rearing its head recently because of municipalities being reticent about adding library millages to the ballot, and not wanting to pay more for library service. So this is something to kind of keep your eye on. And it's also, librarians are kind of trained to provide library service. And so a lot of librarians, they don't pay attention to the money part. It's, oh, we can serve this area and we can provide service to these kids. And so that's what they see. But it's your job to keep your eye on the money. That's what your job is. And it's your job to talk to your director and say, hey, this is not advantageous for us. And let's figure out a way where we can come to a negotiation where we can provide the service, but we're also being properly compensated for it. Because that's how your staff gets benefits, right? That's how your staff gets paid decently, is for you to keep your eye on that ball. You should know what your penal fines are each year. If your director is not telling you or your municipality is not telling you, it's important that you ask, because we have had some issues lately of counties doing it wrong and distributing wrong amounts. And the only way that the Library of Michigan can find out is if somebody notifies us that their penal fines don't look right. So with the current system. So we need you guys to keep your eye on it. And if you see them, they'll fluctuate a little bit, but they shouldn't fluctuate like 100%, right? So if one year you get half as many penal fines, or one year you get twice as many penal fines, it's a good idea to give us a call and say, hey, this doesn't look right. Can you double check? Because in the end, if you get too much, you may end up having to pay that back. The other funding source are state aid libraries. We mentioned this. So the State Aid Act permits the legislature to appropriate an amount of money that they feel is right to give out to public libraries based on certain eligibility requirements. Now, this amount that is appropriated, there's very little in the law that stipulates how much must be given. There is some, but it's a pretty confusing law if you read it. And they put dates in it that make it look like it's only good through the 70s. But essentially, if the legislature keeps appropriating, then we keep giving it out. So the Michigan Library Association has done a fantastic job of advocating for us to keep the penal fines at a decent amount of money. Right now, for this current year, we're about 16 million. On the slide, I have the 2023 amount. I should have updated it, so you would have seen the 2025 amount. And the way that state aid is given out is, first, there's eligibility requirements. You have to meet that 0.3 of a mil of local support. Your staff have to comply with personnel certification requirements. Which is why if you're going to be hiring a new director, it's really important you understand what those requirements are. There is information on our website where it lays all that out. And if you are hiring a director and you have some questions, give us a call, give Joe a call, and we can explain it to you specifically for your library. Your certification depends on your class size, which is based on the number of population you serve. The more population, the higher a class you are. The lower population, the lower class you are. Classes go from 1 to 6. And then every year, your library director, or sometimes it's staff, or sometimes it's members of the board, have to submit an annual report, which is kind of like a statistical report that gives various pieces of information to us, because we're required by statute to keep track of, penal fines and how you use, or not penal fines, state aid and how you use it, and your finances and those kinds of things. The problem with state aid is if you are not eligible for state aid, so let's say you don't meet your 0.3 of a mil, or let's say you hire a new director that does not meet the certification requirements, and you feel they're just a really, really good director, but they just don't have, say, an MLS, or they just miss a part of the, let's say you're a class 5 or 6 library and you hire someone without an MLS. The ramification of that is because the definition of public library at the federal level, okay, so when we get money from the federal government, the IMLS, through the library, the LSTA Act, the definition of public library at the federal level are libraries that meet their state's state aid requirements. So if you do not meet state aid requirements, that means that your library is not eligible to participate in the programs that we use the federal money on. So for example, you would no longer be eligible for E-rate, which is the discount broadband. You would not be eligible for your library to receive LSTA grants, including stipends for your staff to go to continuing education. You may lose access to your Plowed website if you have that through the Library of Michigan. You may lose your cooperative membership because the State Aid Act is also the act that created the cooperatives. And one of the requirements of being in a cooperative is you have to be eligible for state aid. If you lose access to your cooperative, you're going to lose access to the services you get through your cooperative, which can include things like your library ILS, the library, the system that controls your checkouts and your check-ins. So each individual cooperative has its own rules about what happens if somebody loses access to state aid, but the least thing that would happen is that you'd have to pay for everything out of pocket, which could be a lot. So you don't want to lose state aid eligibility is my point for all this. So if you have a question about the most often reason that libraries lose state aid eligibility are not having a director that meets the qualifications and not meeting that 3/10 of a mil. So if you worry that you're in danger of this, then you want to contact myself or Joe, and we can help you understand what the problem is. Usually, after your librarians fill out the state aid report every year, Joe goes through them, and then if he sees a problem, he will contact you and he will say, look, we're seeing that you may not meet state aid eligibility. So it's really important to kind of be in contact with that. The way that the Library of Michigan calculates that 3/10 of a mil is we try very hard to make sure everybody gets as much state aid money as possible. So we look at that 3/10 of a mil holistically and not always individually, but again, it can get a little complicated. So this is another reason why you want to keep your eye on contracts that you are making with other municipalities for service. Those tend to be the number one reason why libraries do not meet the state aid 3/10 of a mil. Shirley, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's exactly how it is. We have to appreciate that we have the experts at Library of Michigan to help you sort out this issue or several issues and how important. I think the classification of directors has become more prevalent than ever. And I know I've had a few phone calls on that too. How do we decide if we've got the right class? How do we know if we got the right number of patrons and so forth? So these are all sources that we need to pay attention to. And Claire is totally correct in emphasizing how important that is to receive your aid. Thank you.
Thank you. So here's a few other sources and programs that add money to your accounts. The PPT, Personal Property Tax Reimbursement Program. This is a program that when the business tax was repealed, it was determined that repealing the business tax was going to affect millage holders in a particular, in counties, and it was going to give them less money because there were less taxes. So the state decided that they would take money out of the 6% fund, the sales tax, and they would reimburse municipalities for monies that they're losing by no longer having the business tax, personal property tax. Now, Treasury calculates how much it is that you get, and then there is the local community stabilization authority is the one that cuts the checks. So those two entities work together, and it was a statute that kind of created all of this. So Treasury has a really great website that is linked on the bottom of this in our resources that will explain to you exactly how the system works, and they provide links to sheets, spreadsheets and stuff that show you, what you would get. They also have a good contact information that if you have a question about, well, how much money are we getting versus we didn't get our check, you can call either Treasury or the local community stabilization authority. And we expect as years go on, your library may be getting less and less of PPT because depending on your community, if your community is, say, bringing in new business or bringing in, say, a new big box store, then that can affect your losses. So again, this is something that if you have questions about it, it can be complicated and it differs from municipality to municipality. You want to kind of contact those people at Treasury or at LSCA. Again, you're always welcome to give me a call and I'd be happy to help you figure out who are the correct people to contact. You may find with the personal property tax reimbursement that if you are not a district library, your PPT reimbursement is going to your municipality because your municipality as a millage holder also gets PPT. So sometimes the local community stabilization authority will send like one check, so to speak, or one online draft, and it'll list every millage holder in that municipality. And then it'll say, okay, we're giving you this much. So X is for the municipality, X is for the library, this much is for the police department, this much is for the fire department, this as much is for, the elderly community center. So, if your municipality is not telling you here is your PPT, then you want to have your director or whoever does your finances communicate with your municipality so that they know they're getting the PPT they should be getting. And that is also something, again, that you should know. You should be aware of all of these financial things and when they're arriving and that it's the correct amount. TIFA. So TIFA is the Recodified Tax Increment Financing Act. And this essentially is, you may have noticed that DDAs, TIFAs, corridor improvement authorities, and like authorities are capturing pieces of millages. And some of the things they do is they capture parts of library millages. Well, years ago, MLA was in 2018, MLA did a really great job of working with various municipal groups to say, hey, we would like libraries to be exempted from these captures. So the way that they did it was that if you have a library millage that was passed after December 31st, 2016, so essentially it's 2017, okay, then that millage is automatically exempt from capture and should not be being captured. So if you have a millage that is still being captured and it was passed after December 31st, 2016, then you're going to want to get your attorney involved and you're going to want to make sure that that doesn't get captured anymore. If your millage was passed prior to January 1st, 2017, then those millages could still be captured. But if the authority, the DDA or whatever, changes its financing, like if it reorganizes its financing, or if it completes the project where those funds were being used, or if it expands its boundaries, then those are incidents during which the library can affirmatively step in and say, we want our millage to be exempted. Now, expanding the boundaries and redoing their financing are two steps which would require a public hearing. And so you want to keep your eyes open for public hearings from your local DDAs and your other authorities. If the project is completed, those are things that the library wants to keep an eye on. This law requires your authorities to have websites that every year tell you what they've completed and whether or not their projects that were using your money were completed. So that would be a time when you would want to, as the board, you would come up with a letter and, a formal letter that would request that your millage is exempted and it would go to the authority. If you're a city library, it gets a little more complicated. In order to exempt your millages, now I don't mean automatic exempt, so not millages that were after, that are passed after December 2016. I'm talking about these older millages. In order to do that letter that says we want to be exempted under those 3 conditions, you have to get permission from your city, and that gets a little bit more complicated. But if you need extra information about this, again, you can contact me and I'd be more than happy to explain it. What's important to know is just recently in Michigan case law, it was affirmed that if you have a renewal, a millage renewal counts as a new millage under this law, and it will be automatically exempted. Shirley, do you have anything you want to mention about that?
No, that's absolutely correct. And we need to keep on top of all of these issues. There, every year when we get new trustees, things become a little bit complicated. And it's important that they understand what is involved in all of these issues and laws, and make sure that all money that is due them comes to them, and that they don't get money that don't belong to them.
Right, exactly. Okay, I'm going to do just a brief about marijuana tax. This we get some questions about. So if you're in a municipality that is benefiting from the marijuana taxes, so under the law that's giving these tax revenues to various municipalities, libraries don't count as like district libraries aren't counted as municipalities. So the only way that you would get these monies is if your municipality gave you some of the money. So this is a reason to build good bridges with your municipality or municipalities, and to, have friends there so that you can say, hey, if you're getting this windfall of money, here's some good programs the library's doing, and maybe you could help us out. But you don't automatically qualify to get money from that program. So we're going to switch now, and we're going to talk a little bit about, now that you've got some money, how can you spend it? So this is, again, just a snapshot, because we could have a whole class on managing public money. But here's just some things to know. So the money that you receive, all of your money in your library account are counted as public money, even if it's the friends giving it to you, even if it's someone comes in with $10 and puts it in a jar for the library. All money that ends up in your account are public funds. Public funds under Michigan law can only be spent for what's called public purposes. Michigan follows what's called the public purpose doctrine. That says that public money can only be used for public benefit, cannot be used for the benefit of individuals. So for a public library, it means that public money can be used to support the operation of the library, to fulfill the mission of the library and your strategic plan. So all of those things like buildings, paying your staff, making sure your staff is paid adequately and fairly, benefits for the staff, all of those things are legal uses of public money. Many expenses that, let's say if you are a business owner, or you are, you're someone who has worked outside the home for, various fields, a lot of common expenses that you may not think about you doing with other businesses cannot happen in public money, right? I came to hear from academia, and there were things that we would do that you can't do with this in a public library. One of them are things like buying food for your staff, buying lunches, buying gifts at Christmas, buying flowers if somebody is sick or has a new baby, buying flowers for a funeral or donating money for a funeral, buying dinner for the board ahead of a board meeting. All of those things are things you cannot do with public money. They are not permitted. Now, let's say that you want to buy coffee for your staff, put coffee in the break room, right? You want to buy them, a pound of Starbucks every month or whatever. You can't do that in the break room with public money, with the library budget. But if you put a coffee pot in the public area, or you brew a pot of coffee, an urn of coffee, and you put it in the public area for members of the public, all kind of things, then your staff can have that too, right? So if it's something that you're offering to the general public, then your staff also can benefit from it. But you can't have something that it's only for the staff, that's paid for with public money. So this gets very, again, gray and complicated. So if specific questions, you're better off talking to your accountant or your attorney. You're also welcome to send a question to me. So your friends group, if you have a friends group, okay, one of the kind of loopholes here is that your friends group is a separate nonprofit corporation. Your friends group is not under the auspices of the library. The library is not in charge of the friends group. The library has no control over the friends group, no legal control over the friends group. The friends group can determine what they use their money for. So unless you have a written agreement with your friends group that requires the friends group to do certain things, then the friends group as a separate corporation has the autonomy to decide how much of their money they're going to give the library and what they want to do with it. They could say, okay, we're going to give the library $5,000 a year and we're going to earmark it for staff appreciation. So by earmarking the money, by giving you a donation and then specifying on the donation what that money is for, then the library has the ability to use that money for what the donor specifically requested. Now, there are some things that won't work for, but for this example, it would work for that. So, these are the kinds of things that, again, you want to just be aware of and you want to, know how possibly to work it out. You want to make sure that your library has or is following appropriate legal financial controls. There are some requirements that the law has how public money is managed. If your municipality is managing your money, and I mean if they're doing more than just cutting your checks and holding your money, then you should have a written agreement with your municipality that lays out, you're going to be our fiscal agent. Here are the things that the library would like you to do for us. Here is what we expect of you. We expect you to have the right policies and procedures. We expect you to give us a certain amount of reports and accounting. And in return, we will pay you for this work. We will pay you an administrative cost to do this. If you're a PA 164 library, the statute requires that municipality hold your money in the and cut your checks. So you don't have to pay them for those two functions. But if they're doing payroll and you're investing and a whole bunch of other things, then that's additional. And you should have a written agreement. It protects both sides of that equation. Because at the end of the day, no matter who's doing your books, if there's an issue with library accounts, it's going to land in the lap of the board. Because the board is the fiduciary and your name will be on the lawsuit. It'll be your disgrace if something happens with the library money. So it's really in your best interest to keep an eye on what's going on and to know how your money is handled and to know that you have the proper accounting procedures and the proper policies in place. Your fund balance. When I say fund balance, I mean the amount of money left over each year out of your budget. If you treat your library account, your fund balance as your savings account, and you have a lot of money just sitting in there, that is a very bad idea. Accountants and auditors would say that you should have from 2 to 6 months of operational money. So if the amount of money it would take to operate the library for 2 to 6 months, if you had something catastrophic happen, you didn't get your millage, or there was some natural disaster. Other than that, any money in addition to that should be in a capital projects fund, should be invested, should be in a separate place, tagged with what you want it to be for, whether you're saving it for, investments. So, big kind of, fund. If you're going to be, planning for roof replacement or a building project or renovations, that would be a capital projects fund. Because what you don't want is to be sitting on 6 figures of money in an account where nobody knows what that money is for, and then you go out for a millage. Because your community will say, why should we give you this money when you're sitting on 6 figures of cash that, by the way, we gave you in a millage to use for library purposes. So A, why are you sitting on so much money doing nothing with it for the library? And B, why are you sitting on so much money and still asking us for a millage? Those are the questions that will come up, because those are the questions that are coming up right now. We have at least 2 libraries in the state that have board elections going on, and candidates are saying one of the first things they're going to do is pull back on the amount of money that is being, the taxes that are being levied under the library millage. They're going to not levy the full amount of the library millage because the library is sitting on a huge fund account. We have another library that was giving a large amount of money through a donation, through like a bequest. And the money just sat in the library's fund balance. And so their municipality said they weren't going to appropriate any money for the library that year because the library had this giant donation they could use for operational money. Now, the library wasn't counting on using that money for operational. They wanted to save it to use it for a bigger project, a more meaningful project. But now they're stuck because they didn't pay attention, and their municipality is like, you have too much money. So you want to be careful and strategic about these things. And if you need to, contact a financial professional who is used to working with public entities, and they will also guide you. Shirley, is there anything you'd like to add about that?
No, and that is so true. One of the first things I ask a library when they want to go for a millage is, what is in your fund balance? How large is your fund balance? And that makes a big difference to the public, and it is very important. It can be, under a separate column, because you're going to need a new roof next year, or you're going to need some new carpet or air conditioning. That can be set aside for that. But and you're right about the auditors wanting no more than 15 to 20%. So that is a very important issue, and I appreciate you talking about it, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, fundraising. So libraries have a couple options for fundraising. You can work with your friends of the library. If you have a foundation, you can work with a foundation. You could start a foundation, or you could fundraise yourself. So libraries as government entities are already tax exempt entities, just like a 501c3. There's a section of the Internal Revenue Code that makes government entities tax exempt. So it's very similar to 501c3. However, you will notice that a lot of grant making organizations only want 501c3s. And that's because a lot of big grant making organizations, particularly ones that give out lots of money, when they bring in lots of people who apply. And so when they go through their applications, they don't want to have to verify each individual application as being an appropriate nonprofit tax exempt. So they require a 501c3, because if the entity is a 501c3, they don't have to double check that they're actually tax exempt. So if you want to go for a big box store grant, or a big grant like Gates Foundation or a giant foundation, I would contact the foundation and tell them you're a government entity, and you can, I can write you a letter on state letterhead that, lists all the appropriate laws and everything, and, tell them, okay, how do we do this since we are tax exempt, but we're not a 501c3? You can also become a 501c3. So a public library can become a 501c3. The thing I'm going to tell you about that is that if you choose to do that, that's great, but it doesn't turn you into a nonprofit corporation. You're still a government entity that has restrictions. So it's important to know that. If you're going to fundraise yourself, you have to make sure that you comply with the Charitable Solicitation Act, which means you have to register with the Attorney General and let them know that you're going to solicit, you're going to fundraise. And I would also recommend that you have policies on what kind of gifts you will not accept and how you accept gifts. And you're going to want to make sure you understand all of the restrictions that you might have in fundraising as a government entity. As far as your friends group is concerned, as I said, your friends group is a separate entity, not under the auspices of the library, not controlled by the library. They are a private nonprofit corporation, so they do have some leeway for things that a government entity may not. They also have to follow the Charitable Solicitation Act requirements. We strongly recommend that if you have a friends group, you negotiate a memorandum of understanding or an agreement with them on how they operate with the library. Everything from how do they physically operate within the library to who decides how friends money is spent. Is there an expectation of a certain percentage of money that is going to go to the library as opposed to administrative costs or other things that the friends group might want to do? So those are really good discussions to get out of the way, because again, friends groups, you can have the friends group for years and years and years and there's never any problem, and then all of a sudden there's a staff change or there's a friends group change and now you have a big problem. And because nobody ever put anything in writing, it's all they said and we said. Right now, one issue that's come up is you have staff, younger and younger staff coming into, more tech savvy staff coming into the library who are rarely familiar with things like eBay and Etsy and selling things online. And so they go through the donated books and find some valuable books or cool books, and they want to sell them online to earn more money. Whereas the friends group either already had a plan for that or had not done that yet, and the staff go in and take the books when they come in and then sell them online, and the friends group goes ballistic. And a lot of that is miscommunication, right? Nobody understands where the lines are. And so these are the kinds of, by having an agreement, you kind of finesse that and make it very clear as to where some of those boundaries are. The one big no-no with government money is stock, either to invest it in or accept as a gift. So if you are going to fundraise, I would recommend talking to your attorney about creating that gift policy. And there are certain record keeping things you also have to kind of keep in mind. So let's talk a little bit about the library director relationship. As I said, this is something that can make or break a library, believe it or not. The first day I started at Library of Michigan, I got a phone call, and the phone call was, how do you get rid of a board member? And then a little bit later that afternoon, I got a call, how do you get rid of a library director? And they were both from the same library. So that was my entry into working with trustees and libraries. I see Shirley laughing down there. So it is, again, one of those things where it can be a great relationship and it can be really miserable. I've had trustees call me in tears. I've had library directors call me in tears. It can make your life miserable. So how do you make it not be miserable? So first of all, it's important to understand that even though the library director is the employee of the board, they're also a partner. And the relationship between a director and the board is very symbiotic, right? Only with both the board and the director working well together does the library flourish, right? Because if the board isn't happy and the director isn't happy, the staff isn't happy, right? When you look at like an place of employment, right? The managers at the upper level of the staff, and it took me actually years of working in libraries to kind of get this, are almost like the parents, right? And the staff are almost like the family, the kids. And if things aren't right at the top, the staff sense it, and it creates a lot of anxiety, and it creates a lot of morale problems. People get worried about their jobs. People start taking sides. It also affects the community, right, that uses the library. So you want to think of your director as a partner, right? As a partner in the success of the library, and respect the librarians, respect the director's job, right? They're the industry professional, right? They're the person who knows the library industry. You are the person responsible for the money. You are the responsible legal party, but the director is the one that is really going to make it happen, right? So you as the board are there to support the director. And when you need to, pull them back a little bit and kind of keep your eye on the money. So you each are checks and balances with each other. Do your best to understand how libraries work so that you can see things from the perspective of your director, right? You don't have to be an authority, but ask questions. Never be afraid to ask questions. You should, and don't, right now, you see boards that kind of sit back and are like, everything's working well here. I don't really need to do anything. The director's got it all in control and she's great. I'm just going to let it happen. That's not what you're there for. And I'm not saying you should cause trouble, but you should be involved. You should be interested. So when the director talks to you, active listening, ask questions. Don't just blindly accept everything because no one person is right all the time, right? So your director has a lot of knowledge and a lot of valuable contributions, but they also need a check and balance, and it's helpful for them to have feedback and support. So don't just sit back and assume that your director knows everything and does everything, right? That's not your job. Your job is to be there to support the director, but also ask questions. The board's job is to delegate your authority and responsibilities. So it's the board that decides what the director does. The statutes lay out what a board's powers are, right? So your establishment statute lays out what your powers are. We looked at some of that last week. The director has no powers listed in the statutes. The board decides what the director's job description looks like. So, again, make sure your director has the authority and the empowerment they need to actually comply with the strategic plan and to do the things that you expect them to do, right? So if you micromanage, then your director's not going to be able to do what you need them to do. If you totally don't pay attention to them at all, then your director's not going to be able to do what you need them to do, right? So anybody who has managed people, that it's a fine thing in between, right? Be in contact with your director, talk to your director, right? Have a liaison from the board, be the person that checks in with the director, just to make sure they have everything they need. How you doing? Are you okay? Especially now with all the book banners and all the public contention that frontline staff are putting up with, check in with the director once in a while. Are you okay? Is everything okay? Is there anything we need to know? Not in a micromanaging kind of vulturing, hanging over kind of way, but just in a friendly, hey, we're here for you way. And if there's anything you need, please feel free to reach out and talk to us. That's the management that you want to have. Make sure you have a good job description, right? Make sure you have a good job description so that the director knows what's expected of them. Are they expected to check in with the board a certain amount of times? Are they expected to do a report on certain things? They can't read your mind, right? If you don't lay out for them what your expectations are, then they're not going to be successful. Take a look at how other libraries work, right? Look at libraries that you hear good things about, that are well regarded, and see what they, ask your library director, what library do you recommend we look at to see that does things right? And they'll tell you, and then take a look at that director. You could take a tour of that library. You could ask them, call the board of that library. We try to do regular meetings so that trustees can talk to each other. Keep your eye out for those so that you can connect. If you're not sure how to connect, contact us. You can contact Shirley. She's also really good at that. And we can help you connect to that other board. Shirley, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's an excellent idea, and ideas for support to the director. There are a number of ways to be supportive, and the board as a whole board, not just me saying how you doing, but how the board would like to know how you are doing. Is there anything we can help you with? Always include the whole board when speaking to these issues. And I think that's very important. And then the director knows too that it isn't just a single
Right.
micromanaging person, but
Right.
it is the whole board that wants to know.
Right.
Thank you.
Oh, that's a very good point. So remember last week we talked about the board being a unit, right? Not individuals. You can't act unilaterally. When I say a liaison, I mean a liaison who goes and checks in with the director, but then reports back to the board. And then, when the director at public meeting is an opportunity to have more conversation. The reason why, it, you know, it's a unique kind of employment situation because the board can't all go talk to the director because then you're stuck with having to have a public meeting. But as an employee, sometimes you want a manager just to check in with you once in a while, right? Sometimes there's personal stuff going on that's affecting your performance, and it's not the kind of thing that you're going to want to stand in front of a public meeting. I mean, it's useful to have that one person, but that one person has to go back and report to the rest of the board. So yeah, it's not one person being told, okay, you're the person that talks to the director and tells them what to do, and you're unilaterally now their boss. No, that's not it at all. It's just like a representative who goes and says, what can the board, what do you need from us? So it's a matter of communication. So it's not like a delegation of authority to one person on the board. Thank you, Shirley, for pointing that out. Some other things to know is you get what you pay for, right? If you're a library that's not paying their library director what the job would suggest should be paid or what the qualifications suggest, then shame on you. And you can't expect a library director is a job that actually, I don't know how some of these library directors do it, to be totally honest. Okay. I work with 400 libraries across the state, and I don't have as much to do as some of these library directors. They literally are jacks of all trades, and they're dealing with members of the public right now in a very contentious time. They're managing other people, they're managing facilities. So really know what their jobs are and what they're doing, and pay them accordingly, support them, and benefits and whatever you can do, right, with your budget. And support continuing education, right? Encourage them to go to conferences. The Library of Michigan has stipends that they can apply for, and the money to go there is not coming all out of the library budget. Encourage them to take a break. It can be enormously helpful to go to a conference and talk to peers and say, these are the problems I'm having, and what do you suggest? And there's opportunities for that all over the place in Michigan, in state, out of state. But your director needs to know that it's okay if they go, and that can only make them stronger and a better director. And the same is true for the staff. Do your homework, right? Look at your statistics, right? How does your library compare with, depending on the number of people you serve, how is it? Do you have enough staff? Do you have enough facilities? Do you have enough? Is there enough fiscal support for the library with the realities of what it's actually doing, right? Surveys. Once in a while, have a survey. Suggest to your director that there's a survey of the community, how the library is doing. Have focus groups. Is there anything that you would like us to see? Encourage your director to do these kinds of things. Don't worry about personnel issues, right? Your job as a board members is not to get involved in personnel, except with the library director. It is not your job to get involved with staff. If a staff member comes to you complaining about something, send them right back to the library director or right back to their supervisor. And the only time that you would deal with a personnel issue is if it's in an appellate situation. So in other words, the staff member has already gone through appropriate channels and they're coming to the board in a board meeting as a last ditch effort to solve a problem. That's the only time you get involved. So it's very important. Nothing can create more issues between a board and the director than getting involved in the things that you've already said are the director's purview. Things like, don't get involved in day-to-day things in the library. I don't care if it's what the staff are doing at the desk. I don't care if it's your perception of whether or not certain work is getting done. I don't care if it's, problems with members of the public you see. You go to the director and say, I saw this, or I have a question about this. I happen to notice this. You don't go to the staff member and say, get off your phone. Okay, it's up to the director to manage the staff. And as we said before, communicate with your director regularly. Shirley, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I love the stay out of the weeds comment. I think that's really good. Because sometimes they'll come to trustees, and I've had it happen. And then, well, I already talked to the director. Well, that's all right. You go back and talk to him again.
Right.
Because, or he or she, whichever, because there obviously is an issue and you want everybody happy, so to speak. But no, I think as trustees, we do need to stay out of the weeds. And I love that comment.
And it goes with members of the public too. If a member of the public comes to you and complains about something, it's perfectly fine, for you to say, oh, I'll take that to the director. But you can also send them to the director because it's the director who deals with the day-to-day issues. In the end, and all of you know this if you've managed people, that when you're managing, you want to be the manager that you want, right? Remember when you were the person in the kind of in the trenches and you had managers. Well, how do you want them to be, right? So you be the manager that you would like to have, right? Doesn't matter that it's a publicly funded entity. You don't have to be more hard ass just because it's tax money. You don't have to be heartless because it's tax money. Okay. Tax money doesn't mean draconian policies, right? Tax money means accountability. It means that you know what it's being spent on and it's being spent reasonably, but reasonably means decent salaries and benefits and good working conditions. So, those are important things to think about. Okay, we're going to switch now to Transparency and Open Meetings Act. So I always think that it's helpful when to make kind of judgment calls if you understand what the purpose of things are. So the Open Meetings Act and the Freedom of Information Act, both of which kind of work together as far as public records are concerned and transparency, are acts that are intended to enable members of the public to participate in government and to know the workings of government, to understand why certain decisions were made and how government does its business. So if you understand that, if you have a question about, what should we do in order to be compliant with the Open Meetings Act? Always err on the side of transparency, right? Always err on the side of transparency. Unless you know for a fact there's a law like the Library Privacy Act or, the laws that, require you to, protect like medical information if someone has an ADA request, then those you would obviously pay attention to. But if it's something that doesn't fall under one of those, you're deciding whether or not to give staff a raise. That's not something you would go into closed meeting about because staff salaries, even connected to specific positions and people, are public record, right? That's public record. So it's kind of important that you know how to distinguish between things that are truly confidential and things that are not. And if you're not sure, then there are some links on this presentation that can help you. You can also contact me. We'd be very happy to help you ferret it out. There's also an Open Meetings Act handbook written by the Attorney General, which is also very handy to figure that out. And that's also linked at the end of this presentation. The members of the public it's very important for members of the public to be able to access this information. I know that sometimes it may seem like, oh, they're just trying to cause trouble, but it is kind of a very basic foundation of our democracy, right? For the people, of the people, by the people. And so that's why, you want to kind of pay attention to this. Okay, it is actually a very important part of our democracy. So under the Freedom of Information Act, which kind of dictates what kind of records are open, just about everything for a public body is open. Now you think of it like, okay, public money pays for how the government operates. So everything is open. If you're paying for it, you get to know what's going on, right? Um, the only things that are not open are things restricted by statute, like I said, like the medical histories of members of the staff, student records for a school library, library records. So someone's borrowing history, personal information, address, all of that stuff in the library database is all really sacrosanct. And then any other kinds of personal information, driver's license numbers, social security numbers, those are protected by other laws. Things of a personal nature that might cause an unwarranted invasion of unwarranted invasion of privacy. This is a little stickier because it's really circumstantial. So this is the kind of thing that if you're not sure, you want to talk to your attorney about. If you're in a public meeting and you're talking about maybe a employee issue, and let's say the employee is having an issue, maybe they're having like a nervous breakdown or they're having job performance issues because they're going through a significant domestic issue, maybe domestic violence, maybe it's their partner's cheating on them kind of thing. That's not the kind of thing that you would yell out in public meeting, right? Because that could cause unwarranted invasion of privacy. Obviously, trade secrets and law enforcement files, right? So those are some things that you do a background check of somebody. Anything available publicly is okay to mention, but if for some reason you do a little bit of a deeper dive and you get access to some records that are not publicly available, then that's something you would never disclose in a public meeting or hand out as a FOIA request. There are certain documents in the library that have to be kept and for a certain amount of time. This is under a document retention schedule, which is also linked at the end of this presentation so you can see. Board meeting notes are kept in perpetuity. That means from the time your library opened all the way through now, your library should have every board meeting minutes that you've ever done. Many libraries do not have all of them. Some actually do. But right now, every minute that you keep, every board meeting minutes have to be kept. You can never expunge them. And a lot of things belonging to the board, financial records, all of that is kept in perpetuity. You're going to want to make sure you have a FOIA coordinator. It could be your director. You could work with your municipality to be your FOIA coordinator. FOIA is getting more and more complicated because we're seeing a big rise in requests and a big rise in large requests. Sometimes it's used as a way to harass an organization. Sometimes it's not, but you want to make sure that you're on the right side of that law. So again, I would certainly recommend that if you do your own FOIA, you take a look at your FOIA procedures. If you haven't looked at them in a while, look at them with your attorney, make sure, or ask your director to look at them with the attorney, make sure that they are still compliant, make sure that the staff that handle your FOIA know what they're doing, because it is becoming I talked to a couple lawyers who do library law in our state, and right now they're saying the big thing is they're being inundated by FOIA questions. There's some really weird FOIA stuff going on, and you want to just make sure that everything is being done correctly. And again, same with your municipality. If your municipality does it, you have every right to ask your municipality what their policies are and make sure that their policies are compliant with what in reality should be done. And remember too that libraries are a little bit different. Libraries have some different situations than your municipality does. And it might be important for your municipality to make sure they understand that. Financial informations are open book. So salaries, as I mentioned, all your benefits, your budgets, your bills, a lot of things that you may think are not public are public. So sometimes like salaries were always, to me, even growing up, we never knew what my dad made. It was none of your business, right? And when you earned money, it was none of your business how much you make. That's not true as a public employee, right? So sometimes it's a leap between what you might be used to as working in private industry or a corporation and what's in public entity. Someone can ask for a list of your staff and what they make and what their benefits are, and that is perfectly legal to hand out. The personnel evaluations are perfectly open record, right? Of course, if you're talking about like an ADA accommodation, that would be redacted. But generally, if you're telling someone they're doing a horrible job, that's open record, right? And someone can request that, including your directors. FOIA. So some of the tips, and this is common, if you are using your personal email account for your board work, I would stop. You want to have an email account from the library. The library has even if you use a Google account, that's, board member number 5, Michigan Public Library @gmail.com. Because you want an email account that you can distance yourself from, right? That is only your board stuff. Because the ramifications are, if something happens and someone FOIA's emails, which they can, then you have to go through your own personal email and pull out those emails and send them within a certain amount of time to the FOIA coordinator to send on to the person requesting it. And that can be a big pain in the butt. It's also, if something goes to a lawsuit, well, now they can subpoena your email. And that means they can subpoena your whole email and look at all your personal emails. Same thing with texting. They could subpoena your phone, right? If you're using your phone, they could subpoena your phone. So you want to be very careful about using your personal devices and your personal emails for board work. Okay. If you're going to use your personal devices, make sure you're using an email account that is part of your library. If your library doesn't want to give the board an email account, which we've been telling directors they really need to have one, first of all, you're the board, you're the boss. So you say, you know what, we're going to pay extra money, we're going to get our own account. Or go through Gmail, create a Gmail account. This also means that your director, whoever your FOIA person in the library is, could then just access those accounts and pull the information they need without you having to do it, right? Because all of those emails are public record anyway. You shouldn't be discussing anything that is, super not appropriate. All of your records, your bylaws, your minutes should be very easily available. And I'd recommend you throw them on the website, because if you throw them on the website, then nobody has to worry about them for FOIA, right? You just like point to it and the person who's asking can just get it. Again, talk to your attorney about a FOIA policy for your board communications in terms of things like texts and stuff. And if someone requests a record and you're not sure if it's available under FOIA, you want to always talk to your attorney, because some surprising things can be. So I see that we are at time. We spent a little bit more time on funding than I usually do, but I think it's extremely important. As I said, there's not a huge amount of slides here. A lot of it is stuff that we talked about. I'm going to give the last word to Shirley, but I want to remind you that if you have a question, please don't hesitate to contact us. And you can see we have a whole bunch of resources here that you will have access to. And I hope that you have a good rest of your day, good rest of your week. And Shirley, I'm going to let you sign us off.
Thank you, Claire. As usual, a very, very informative workshop. I know that it sounds like being on a board of trustees is very complicated. I could never do that. There's too much information requested. There sounds like there's too many rules and policies. That is what makes being a trustee simple. And we need to have them available. Claire is right about contacting attorneys. That's what we have them for, especially Claire. I also, as in the past, want to bring up the fact of our trustee manual, the Michigan Public Library trustee manual. The last one is the 2021 edition. There are a lot of answers for you in there that you don't need to contact the attorney. You don't need to contact Claire unless you want to talk to her because she's very interesting to talk to. And I'm also available, but please refer to that frequently because there's so much in there that will answer in simple form the reasons that a trustee does what it does, or as a partnership. Remember, trustees work together. It's a board of directors. You are the other board in town, which I always emphasize. You're like your city commission, your county commission, your township board. These are all important entities, and the trustee board of trustees is that also. So keep that in mind. You are as important as they are, whether you're appointed or elected, and take the job seriously, and there should be no issues. Remember that you are very involved in the community, and people will hold you accountable if you think you aren't. You're very, the democracy is very important. So thank you. Thank you, Claire, for letting me share that. And I'm trusting that all of you that were signed in found some rewards from the information that was presented to you. Thanks again, and until next time, thank you for signing in.
Thanks, everybody.